I remember the exact moment the world I knew stopped making sense. It wasn't loud. There was no gunshot, no shattered glass, no woman screaming from the end of the street. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that sits on your chest like a stone and doesn't move. I was standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, coffee going cold in my hand, watching Patrick Walter shake hands with a man I knew had blood on his, and Patrick was smiling. Not the stiff smile of a man doing what he had to do, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind you give someone you're glad to see. I stood there long enough for the coffee to go completely cold, long enough for the two of them to part ways, and for Patrick to walk back inside without ever noticing me in the shadow of that doorframe. I didn't say a word. I just set the cup down on the porch railing and walked to the stables. I needed to think, and I knew, the way you know before you're ready to admit it, that everything I was about to find out was going to cost me something I could never get back. The town of Harrow Flats woke up slow that morning, the way it always did. Dust hanging in the air like it hadn't decided where to land yet. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down mixing with the dry, ancient smell of the earth itself. Horses nickering softly in their stalls. Women sweeping porches. Children running errands they didn't want to run. Austin Williams moved through all of it like a ghost. Boots quiet on the packed dirt, hat pulled low, eyes forward but not seeing any of it. His mind was still in that doorway, still watching Patrick's hand close around the other man's, and pump it twice with the easy warmth of an old friendship. The man's name was Cutter Dale, one of Jeremy Rogers' outriders. Austin had run him out of a saloon fight 8 months ago, and told him never to come back to Harrow Flats. And yet there he was, on the main street, shaking the sheriff's hand in broad daylight. Austin reached the stables, pressed his back against the wooden wall, and let out a breath so long it felt like it had been trapped in his chest for years. He didn't know yet how deep it went, but he knew, with the cold, certain instinct of a man who has spent his life reading danger, that he was standing at the edge of something that was going to swallow everything he had ever trusted. Austin Williams was 17 years old the first time Patrick Walter stopped him from making the worst mistake of his life. It was a Tuesday evening in late summer, the sky bruised purple and orange over the rooftops of Harrow Flats, and Austin had a broken bottle in his hand and murder in his eyes. The boy he was about to use it on had stolen 3 months of wages from his sick mother, had walked into her house while Austin was out working the fields, and taken every coin she had saved in a tin beneath her bed. Austin had tracked him to the alley behind the feed store and had him cornered against the wall, and he was not thinking about consequences or law or anything else except the rage that had been building in his chest since he was old enough to understand that the world was not fair. Then a hand closed around his wrist. Firm, not violent, just certain. He turned and found Patrick Walter looking at him with eyes that were calm in a way Austin had never seen on a grown man before. Calm the way deep water is calm, not empty, just settled. "Put it down, son," Patrick said quietly, "not because he doesn't deserve it, but because you do." Austin stood there shaking for a long moment, the broken glass catching the last of the evening light, his chest heaving with everything he hadn't been able to say out loud since his mother first got sick. Then he dropped the bottle. It shattered on the ground between them. Patrick didn't flinch. He just nodded once, like something had been decided. He recovered the stolen wages through legal means within the week. He never once mentioned the alley again. Austin was wearing a deputy's badge within the year, and on the morning Patrick pinned it to his chest, the older man had looked at him with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. "The badge doesn't make you the law," Patrick told him that morning. "You make the law. Don't ever forget which one of you is in charge." Austin had carried those words like a second heartbeat ever since. He had repeated them to himself on hard nights, on confusing mornings, on the days when the job asked more of him than he thought he had left to give. Patrick Walter had not just given him a career. He had given him a reason to believe that a man could choose who he became regardless of where he started. That was not a small thing. That was everything. For 12 years after that morning, Austin had never had a single reason to question it. Patrick ran a clean office, firm without being cruel, respected without being feared. He had a way of walking into a room full of tension and draining it without raising his voice. A way of making people feel like the law was on their side, even when it was telling them no. Austin had watched him talk a grieving widow out of burning down her neighbor's barn over a boundary dispute that had been festering for a decade. had watched him sit with a dying drifter nobody else would touch, just so the man wouldn't cross over alone on a cold Thursday night with rain hitting the jailhouse roof. Had watched him stand between an angry mob and a frightened young man accused of something he didn't do, and not move an inch while 20 men shouted and shoved and threatened. Patrick had just stood there, quiet, immovable, like a wall that had decided it was never going to fall. These were not the actions of a corrupt man. These were the actions of someone who understood, bone deep, what the badge was for. And that was exactly what made the memory of Cutterdale's handshake so devastating. Because it didn't fit. It didn't fit the man Austin had watched and learned from and trusted with his life for over a decade. Which meant one of two things. Either Austin had never really known him at all, or something had changed Patrick Walter so slowly, so quietly, so gradually, the way rot moves through old wood, that even the man himself might not have felt it happening until the damage was already done. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling at something in you, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's get back to Harrow Flats, because what Austin finds next, it's going to change everything. Austin noticed Christine Tyler for the first time on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after he saw Cutterdale on the main street. He had been watching the town differently since then, the way a man watches a room after he hears something fall in the dark. Not panicked, just alert, tuned to frequencies he hadn't been listening to before. Christine ran the grain store her late husband had built from nothing on the corner of Harrow Flats Main Street, a wide-fronted building with sun-bleached wood and a hand-painted sign that swayed in the wind. She was a small woman, sharp-eyed and straight-backed, the kind of person who looked like she had never asked anyone for anything in her life and didn't plan to start. Austin had always respected her quietly from a distance, the way you respect someone who carries their hardship without advertising it. But that Wednesday morning she was standing outside her store with a look on her face that stopped him mid-stride. Not grief, not anger, something worse than both. The look of a person who has accepted something they should never have had to accept. He crossed the street toward her. She saw him coming and the look vanished, replaced by something careful and composed. "Morning, deputy," she said evenly. "Morning, Mrs. Tyler," he said. He glanced at the store behind her. The front window had a crack in it that hadn't been there last week. She caught him looking. "Wind," she said simply. He nodded slowly. They both knew it wasn't the wind. He tipped his hat and kept walking, but his mind was already turning, already pulling at the thread she had just handed him without meaning to. He started asking questions that afternoon, carefully, quietly, the way Patrick had taught him. Not direct. Never direct when the person you're talking to is scared. You come at it sideways, like you're just making conversation, like you just happened to wander into their orbit. He stopped by the barber first, a thin, nervous man named Colm, who talked too much when he was relaxed and too little when he wasn't. Colm was too little that day. One-word answers. Eyes that kept moving to the door. Austin left without pushing and tried the feed store next. Same thing. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Hatch, who Austin had never once seen rattled by anything, fumbled his words twice and spilled a jar of nails he had been holding steady for 20 minutes. Before Austin walked in, the fear was identical in both of them. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the dull, grinding fear of something ongoing, something they had learned to live inside of. Austin walked back to the office that evening with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground, cataloging everything he had seen. Then, 2 nights later, he saw the wagons. 3 of them, moving through the south end of town well past midnight, no lanterns, no noise beyond what the horses couldn't help making, no markings on the canvas, no stop at the marshal's post, no paperwork. Just cargo moving through Harrow Flats in the dark like it had every right to be there. Austin watched from the shadow of a doorway until they were gone. Then he stood alone in the empty street, for a long time, the night air cold against his face, and felt the shape of something much larger than a cracked window beginning to form in the darkness around. Austin found Jesse Brandon on a Friday evening at the back table of the Silver Nail Saloon, nursing a whiskey he clearly hadn't paid for, and watching the room with the restless eyes of a man who was always either waiting for trouble or running from it. Jesse was Patrick's collector. Everybody in Harrow Flats knew it even if nobody said it out loud. He was the kind of man who existed in the space between official and unofficial. Never quite dirty enough to arrest, and never quite clean enough to trust. Medium height, thin through the shoulders, with a habit of touching the brim of his hat when he was nervous that Austin had catalogued years ago. Austin pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited. Jesse's hand went straight to his hat brim. "Deputy," he said, his voice landing somewhere between casual and cautious. "Jess," Austin replied. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just let the silence sit between them like a third person at the table. Jesse filled it the way nervous men always do. "Slow night," he offered. Austin nodded. "Been a slow few weeks," he said, "except for the wagons." Jesse's glass stopped halfway to his mouth, just for a second, just long enough. He recovered smoothly, brought the glass up, took a sip, set it down. "Don't know anything about any wagons," he said. Austin smiled with his mouth only. "Didn't say you did," he replied. "Just making conversation." They sat for another few minutes, Austin asking nothing, Jesse answering everything with his body. The way his shoulders had climbed toward his ears, the way his fingers tapped a rhythm on the table that had no music behind it, the way his eyes kept cutting to the door like he was calculating the distance. Austin let him sweat for exactly as long as it took Jesse to finish his drink and signal for another. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. Voice dropped low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. "Jess," he said quietly, "I've known you 6 years. I know you're not a bad man. I know you're a man who made a choice at some point that felt small at the time and got bigger than you expected." Jesse said nothing, but he had gone very still. "I'm not here to put you in a cell," Austin continued. "I'm here because something is moving through this town that shouldn't be, and people are scared, and I need to understand what I'm looking at before somebody gets hurt." Jesse stared at his fresh whiskey for a long time. The saloon noise moved around them, laughter from the bar, cards being shuffled at the next table, a piano playing something melancholy in the corner. Finally Jesse spoke, his voice barely above a breath. "You should leave this one alone, Austin." It was the first time he had used his first name. "Why?" Austin asked. Jesse looked up at him then, and what Austin saw in his eyes was not defiance or warning. It was something that looked a great deal like pity. "Because the man you'd have to go through," Jesse said slowly, "is not a man you want to go through." He picked up his glass. His hand was not entirely steady. "Because he already knows you were in that doorway the morning Cutter Dale came to town," Jesse said slowly. "And he's been watching you ever since, waiting to see what you do with it." The piano kept playing in the corner. Austin sat very still, the words settling into him one by one like stones dropping into still water. Patrick already knew. Patrick had been watching him. The thread he had been pulling so carefully, so quietly, so privately. Patrick had felt every tug. Austin pushed back his chair, stood, straightened his hat. "Thanks for the drink," he said, though neither of them had touched the other's glass. He walked out of the Silver Nail into the cold night air and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, breathing slowly. The street was empty. The stars were hard and bright overhead. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond the edge of town, 3 more wagons were probably moving, and the man who was supposed to stop them was the reason they moved freely. Austin had spent 3 days hoping he was wrong. Jesse Brandon had just made sure he couldn't hope that anymore. The town of Harrow Flats held its annual harvest dinner on the last Saturday of October, and Patrick Walter had not missed it in 11 years. It was held in the wide lot behind the church, long tables draped in white linen going yellow at the edges, lanterns strung between wooden posts casting everything in warm amber light that made the whole scene look like something out of a painting. The whole town came, farmers and merchants and drifters who had stayed long enough to feel like they belonged. Women in their best dresses with their hair pinned up carefully, children chasing each other between the tables while their mothers called after them, without much conviction. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread and wood smoke hung over everything like a blessing. It was the one night of the year when Harrow Flats forgot its hardships and remembered what it was trying to be. A real town, a good town, a place worth the trouble of building. Austin arrived late and stood at the edge of the firelight, with his hat in his hands, watching. He had not planned to come at all. He had sat in his room above the livery for an hour, telling himself there was no point, that he had nothing to celebrate and less to pretend. But something had pulled him here anyway. Maybe he needed to see it. Maybe some part of him needed to look Patrick Walter in the eye across a crowded room and test whether what he now knew would show on his face. Patrick was at the center table, the way he always was. Not because he demanded it, but because people naturally arranged themselves around him the way water arranges itself around a stone. He was laughing at something the Reverend had said, his head thrown back, one hand flat on the table. his whole body loose with the ease of a man who had nothing to hide and nowhere to be but here. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples and the deep lines around his eyes and made him look like exactly what the town believed him to be. A good man. A steady man. The kind of man a town builds itself around and thanks God for on cold nights. Austin watched him and felt something he hadn't expected. Not the sharp anger he had been bracing for. Not the cold certainty of the previous nights out by the wagons or across from Jesse Brandon in the Silver Nail. What he felt was grief. Plain, wordless, boneless grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself with noise. The kind that just moves in quietly and sits down and makes itself at home in your chest like it was always going to end up there. He had been standing at the edge of the light for nearly 40 minutes, nursing a cup of cider he had barely tasted, when Patrick excused himself from the center table just after 9 o'clock. He rose the way he did everything, unhurried, graceful, touching the Reverend's shoulder as he went, leaning down to say something to old Hatch from the feed store that made the man laugh and slap his knee. Then he moved 2 seats down and paused beside Christine Tyler, and Austin watched Patrick look her in the eye with what appeared to be genuine warmth. A hand briefly on her shoulder, a few words, exchanged, Christine nodding with a small, tired smile. And something in Austin's chest tightened so hard it nearly took his breath, because Patrick had been bleeding her dry for months. Every week, Jesse Brandon showed up at her grain store and collected, and every week Christine paid because she had no choice, because the man she was paying was the only law in Harrow Flats, and there was nowhere else to turn. And here was that same man resting his hand on her shoulder at the harvest dinner with the easy tenderness of someone who genuinely cared. Austin didn't know which was worse, that Patrick was capable of that kind of cruelty, or that he had become so comfortable inside it that he no longer felt the contradiction at all. Patrick moved through the rest of the crowd toward the outer edge of the lamplight, nodding and smiling, shaking hands, pausing to ruffle the hair of a small boy who grabbed at his coat sleeve. Then he stepped beyond the last lantern and into the darkness at the back of the lot. Austin set his cider down on the nearest table and followed at a distance, moving along the outer rim of the gathering, keeping to the shadows, his boots finding the quietest ground. The laughter and music of the dinner faded behind him as he went. Patrick stopped near the old fence line at the far end of the property and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the dark. A moment later, a second figure materialized from the tree line beyond the fence, lean and dark-coated, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything he had done in his life. Austin didn't recognize the face, but he recognized the brand burned into the saddle of the horse tied to the fence post. A double-loop R pressed deep into the leather. Jeremy Rogers' mark. Austin stood in the darkness 20 feet away, close enough to see the shape of the exchange but not the words. Patrick leaned in. The other man spoke first, briefly, and then Patrick responded, calm, measured, nodding twice. They were not arguing. They were not negotiating. This was not 2 men reaching an agreement. This was 2 men maintaining one. When they were done, Patrick clapped the man once on the arm with the same easy warmth he had given the Reverend and Christine and everyone else at that table, and turned and walked back toward the light without looking back. Austin pressed himself against the fence post and waited until the Roger man had disappeared into the tree line and the sound of hooves had faded completely into the dark. Then he stood alone at the fence line for a long time, the distant laughter of the harvest dinner floating toward him on the cold October air like something from another world. He had spent days building toward this moment, collecting fragments, testing theories, lying awake at night, constructing arguments for why it might still be something other than what it looked like. There were no more arguments left. Patrick Walter was not a man who had been corrupted suddenly or violently. He was a man who had been corrupted slowly, carefully in the dark, the way the best betrayals always happen. And Austin Williams, standing alone at the fence line with the cold ground under his boots and the stars hard and indifferent overhead, finally allowed himself to know it completely. The last door had closed, and there was no going back through it. The fire started just after 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and by the time the first bucket brigade had formed, it had already eaten through the back wall of Christine Tyler's grain store and was working its way hungrily toward the front. The night sky above Harrow Flats turned the color of a wound, deep orange bleeding into black at the edges, smoke rising in thick columns that blotted out the stars. People came running from every direction, some still in their night clothes, boots half-laced, hair loose, faces slack with the particular shock of being pulled from sleep into disaster. The bell above the church was ringing. Dogs were barking from every yard on the street. Children were crying somewhere in the crowd. And in the middle of all of it, standing on the opposite side of the street with a blanket around her shoulders and her eyes fixed on the burning building, was Christine Tyler. She was not crying. She was not shouting. She was just watching her late husband's life's work burn with an expression on her face that was so composed it was almost frightening. The expression of a woman who had already done all her grieving in advance, who had known somewhere in the back of her mind that something like this was coming and had quietly prepared herself for it without ever admitting she was doing so. Austin arrived at a dead run, Badge catching the firelight as he pushed through the crowd toward the bucket line. He shouted orders, directed men to the well, moved people back from the structure as the front window finally shattered outward from the heat. The work was hard and hot and relentless, and it took the better part of an hour before the flames were reduced to smoking ruin. When it was over, Austin stood in the street with his coat singed and his hands blistered and looked at what remained of the building. The front wall was still standing, barely. Everything behind it was gone. He found Christine exactly where she had been standing when he arrived, the blanket still around her shoulders, her eyes still on the wreckage. The crowd had thinned by then, neighbors drifting back to their homes, a few men lingering to make sure the embers didn't catch again, children being steered firmly away by their mothers. Austin crossed the street toward her and stopped a few feet away. He didn't know what to say. He had been a deputy for long enough to know that there was rarely anything useful to say to a person standing in front of the ruins of something they had loved. So he said nothing at first, just stood beside her and looked at what the fire had left. After a long moment, Christine spoke, her voice low and even, and completely without heat. "You know who did this," she said. It was not a question. Austin was quiet for a moment. "I have suspicions," he said carefully. Christine turned to look at him then, really look at him, and what he saw in her eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was something much harder and much more specific than either of those things. It was the look of a woman who had been let down by the law so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it, who had learned to factor its failure into every calculation she made about her own survival. It was the look of a person who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the men wearing badges were part of the problem until proven otherwise. And in that look, Austin saw himself the way she saw him, not as a man who was quietly working toward justice, not as someone who had spent sleepless nights piecing together the shape of Patrick Walter's corruption, but as another badge, another uniform, another representative of the system that had been squeezing her dry every week through Jesse Brandon's collections and had now burned her store to the ground as a warning. "Suspicions," she repeated softly. The word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked back at the ruins. "My husband built that store with his hands," she said. "Took him 4 years. We didn't eat well those 4 years. We didn't sleep well either. But he built it because he believed that if you worked hard enough and kept your head down and didn't bother anybody, this town would let you live in it in peace." She paused. The last of the embers glowed orange in the darkness. "He was wrong," she said simply, "and I was wrong to keep believing it after he was gone." Austin stood beside her in the smoking dark and felt the weight of her words settle into him the way only true things do, not with a crash, but with a slow grinding pressure that found every weak point and pushed. She was right. Not about him specifically. He had not known, had not been complicit, had been working in the dark towards something he couldn't yet prove. But she had no way of knowing that, and more than that, her broader point was true regardless of his individual innocence. The law in Harrow Flats had failed her, the badge had failed her. The system that was supposed to stand between her and the kind of men who burned buildings in the middle of the night had instead been running cover for them, collecting a cut, looking the other way. Austin had worn that badge for 12 years. He had been proud of it. He had believed in what it represented with the same uncomplicated conviction that Patrick Walter had planted in him the night he stopped a 17-year-old boy from making the worst mistake of his life. And standing here now in the ashes of Christine Tyler's store, he understood for the first time what it cost a person to believe in something that turned out to be hollow. He understood it because he was living it himself. He looked at her profile in the dim light, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, and made a decision so quiet it barely felt like a decision at all, more like an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided. "I'm going to fix this," he said. Christine didn't look at him. "I've heard that before," she said. "From better men than you." Austin nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I'm going to fix it anyway." Austin walked into the sheriff's office the following morning at 7 o'clock, earlier than either of them usually arrived, while the town was still pulling itself out of sleep and the street outside was empty, except for a stray dog nosing at the boardwalk. He had not slept. He had sat in his room above the livery for the better part of the night, with his boots still on and his coat still buttoned, staring at the wall, going over everything he knew, and everything he still couldn't prove, and everything that Christine Tyler's eyes had said to him in the dark, outside her ruined store. He had arrived at the same place every time, no matter which direction he approached it from. There was only one move left to make before he started building a formal case, and it was the one he had been dreading since the night he watched Patrick shake hands with Jeremy Rogers' man at the fence line. He needed to look Patrick Walter in the eye and give him the chance to explain himself. Not because he expected an explanation that would change anything, not because he thought there was still a version of this story where Patrick came out clean on the other side, but because 12 years meant something, because the man had pinned a badge to his chest and told him that the law was only as good as the person wearing it, and Austin believed, even now, even after everything, that you owed a debt that size at least one honest conversation before you burned it to the ground. Patrick was already at his desk when Austin came in, which was unusual. He was reading something, a folded paper that he set face down on the desk when Austin entered, smoothly and without hurry, the way a man sets something down when he has been expecting company and has already decided how he wants the room to look when it arrives. He looked up at Austin with the same calm, steady eyes that had defined him for as long as Austin had known him. Eyes that gave nothing away, that had always seemed to Austin like the eyes of a man with a clean conscience, and that now seemed to him like something else entirely. "Heard about the fire," Patrick said. "Hell of a thing." Austin closed the door behind him and stood in the middle of the room without sitting down. "Hell of a thing," he agreed quietly. Patrick leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. He did not ask Austin why he had come. He did not ask why he was standing instead of sitting, or why he had arrived an hour early, or why he was looking at him the way he was looking at him. He just waited, and in that waiting, in the absolute stillness of it, in the complete absence of the confusion or concern that an innocent man would have shown, Austin found the last piece of confirmation he had been looking for. Patrick already knew exactly why he was here. He had known it was coming. He had probably known since the morning Cutter Dale shook his hand on the main street and Austin's coffee went cold in the doorway. The whole conversation that followed was just a formality they both had to get through, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Austin laid it out plainly, the way Patrick himself had once taught him to deliver hard information. No dramatics, no accusations dressed up as questions, just the facts in the order he had found them. The merchants paying Jesse Brandon every week, the wagons moving through town at night with no manifests and no stops at the marshal's post, Cutter Dale on the main street, the man with Jeremy Rogers' brand on his saddle at the fence line behind the church, Christine Tyler's store burning 12 hours after Austin had started asking questions in her direction. He laid it all out in the space of about 4 minutes, his voice level and quiet. And when he was done, he stopped talking and let the silence come back into the room. Patrick had not moved during any of it, had not blinked more than was natural, had not shifted in his chair, had not shown a single sign of the discomfort that the guilty usually couldn't contain when their architecture was laid out in front of them piece by piece. When Austin finished, Patrick was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance somewhere between them, and then he exhaled slowly through his nose and looked up. "You're a good deputy, Austin," he said. His voice was not defensive, it was not cold. It carried something that sounded impossibly like genuine respect. "Always have been. Best I've ever had." Austin said nothing. Patrick unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the desk. "Jeremy Roger was coming through this county regardless of what I did or didn't do," he said. "That's just geography. That's just the way the roads run and the way the man operates. I couldn't have stopped it with every deputy in the territory, so I made a decision." He paused. "I decided that if it was going to happen anyway, this town was going to get something out of it, instead of just absorbing the damage." He said it the way a man states a position he has rehearsed so many times it no longer feels like a rationalization. Cleanly, evenly, without visible shame. As if the logic of it was so airtight that the only question remaining was whether Austin was smart enough to see it. The merchants, Austin said. His voice was very quiet. Patrick's jaw tightened slightly. The first crack in the surface. Insurance, he said, in a manner of speaking. A man like Roger doesn't respect a town that doesn't cost him something. The collections kept us on his list of places worth protecting instead of places worth taking. Austin looked at him for a long moment. Christine Tyler's store burned last night, he said. Patrick held his gaze. I heard, he said, that wasn't sanctioned. But it happened, Austin said, under your watch, using your arrangement as cover. The silence between them stretched long and tight. Then Patrick reached into the drawer on his right side and set something on the desk between them, a leather pouch. It landed with the soft, heavy sound of coins. There's enough there to rebuild her store twice over, Patrick said quietly, and enough left for a man who understands how this county actually works to live very comfortably while he's keeping it in order. Austin looked at the pouch on the desk. He looked at it for long enough that Patrick might have thought he was considering it. Then he looked up at Patrick Walter, at the face he had known for 16 years, at the eyes that had once looked at him across a broken bottle in a summer alley and seen something worth saving, and felt the last living thread of what they had been to each other go quiet and still inside his chest. I'll be seeing you, Sheriff, he said. He turned and walked to the door. He did not touch the pouch. He did not look back. He stepped out into the morning air and pulled the door shut behind him and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, with the cold light of the day on his face and the full weight of what came next settling across his shoulders like something he had always known he was going to have to carry. The street was waking up around him. A woman was opening the shutters of the bakery across the way. A boy was sweeping the steps of the dry goods store. Harrow Flats was beginning its day the way it always did. Slowly, quietly, with no idea what was coming. Austin pulled his coat straight, set his hat, and stepped off the boardwalk into the street. He had work to do. Austin began on the morning after he walked out of Patrick's office before the town was fully awake, before the bakery had opened its shutters or the first horses had been brought out of the stables. He sat at the small desk in his room above the livery, with a blank ledger open in front of him, and a lantern burning low at his elbow, and started writing. He wrote slowly and carefully, the way Patrick had once taught him to write incident reports, not with emotion, not with opinion, but with fact, date, location, observation. He started from the beginning, from the morning he had stood in the doorway, with his coffee going cold, and watched Cutterdale shake Patrick Waltle's hand on the main street. And he worked forward from there in strict chronological order. The cracked window at Christine Tyler's grain store, the fear in Colm the barber's eyes, the way Hatch had fumbled his words at the feed store, the wagons moving south through town after midnight with no lanterns and no markings and no stops at the marshal's post. Jesse Brandon's glass stopping halfway to his mouth in the Silver Nail, the brand on the saddle at the fence line behind the church. Christine's store burning at 2 a.m, 2 days after Austin had started pulling at threads in her direction. Patrick's voice in the office, flat and calm and utterly without remorse, explaining how he had decided that the town would be better served by profiting from Jeremy Rogers' operation than by fighting it. The leather pouch on the desk between them, heavy with coins, sitting there like a test Austin had been expected to fail. He wrote all of it down in the careful, measured hand of a man who understood that what he was building was not just a record but a weapon, and that a weapon badly made was worse than no weapon at all. When he had finished the first pass, he went back to the beginning and read it through slowly, checking for gaps, for assumptions he had stated as facts, for places where his own anger or grief had crept into the language and made it personal instead of evidentiary. He found 3 such places and rewrote them. Then he read it through again. Outside town was coming to life. The sounds of morning drifting up from the street below, the smell of wood smoke and coffee and horses and earth. Austin sat in the middle of all of it, like a man in the eye of something, his pen moving steadily across the page, building the case that was going to end the career of the only man who had ever believed in him before he had given anyone a reason to. The hardest part was not the writing. The hardest part was the corroboration, going back to the people he had already spoken to and asking them to do something that everything in their experience told them was dangerous. He started with Jesse Brandon, Not because Jesse was the strongest witness, but because Jesse was the most frightened. And Austin had learned long ago that a frightened witness needed to be handled before a calm one, or the fear had time to harden into refusal. He found Jesse at his boarding house on Thursday morning, still in his nightshirt, and sat across from him at the small kitchen table, while Jesse's landlady pointedly made noise in the next room to signal that she was present and listening. Austin laid it out simply. What he was building, what he needed, what Jesse's cooperation would mean for Jesse's own future when the whole thing came apart, which it was going to do regardless of whether Jesse helped or not. Jesse stared at the table for a long time. His fingers found the edge of the tablecloth and worried at it in small, repetitive movements that he didn't seem to be aware of. "He'll know it was me," Jesse said finally. "He'll know before the ink is dry." "He'll know anyway," Austin said. "The moment I file this with the county marshal, he's going to go through every person I've spoken to in the last 2 weeks and work out who talked. Your name is already on that list whether you sign a statement or not." Jesse looked up at him. His face was the face of a man who had been living inside a bad decision for so long that the original moment of choice had become unrecognizable to him, buried under years of small compromises and quiet justifications, until he could no longer clearly remember when exactly he had become the kind of person he had become. Austin recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror on more than one morning recently, asking himself how he had spent 12 years beside Patrick Walter, without seeing what was right in front of him. "I'll need it in writing," Austin said quietly. "Everything you collected, every name, every amount, every time." Jesse closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in them had shifted. Not resolved exactly, but resigned. The way a man looks when he has finally stopped fighting a current that was always going to win. "Give me the paper," he said. Austin slid it across the table without a word. He went to Christine Tyler next, and she was easier than he expected. Not because she was less frightened, but because she had already decided, standing in front of her burning store with a blanket around her shoulders, that she was done being quiet. She signed without hesitation, her handwriting small and precise and absolutely steady, and when she handed the paper back to Austin, she looked at him with eyes that had lost the hard suspicion of the night of the fire and replaced it with something more complicated. Not quite trust, but the cautious provisional opening that sometimes preceded it. Hatch from the feed store took 2 visits and a long conversation about his family before he agreed. Colm the barber took 3. By the end of the following week, Austin had 7 signed statements, a fully documented account of the smuggling routes, cross-referenced against the nights he had personally observed the wagons, and a letter drafted to Marshal Briggs in the next county, laying out the complete picture in terms that left no room for interpretation or dismissal. He sealed the letter on a Sunday evening, pressed his thumb against the wax, and sat back in his chair and looked at what he had built spread across the desk in front of him. It was enough. He knew it was enough. And he knew that the moment he sent that letter, the clock started running. For Patrick, for Jeremy Roger, and for Austin himself, who was about to become the most inconvenient man in Harrow Flats. He blew out the lantern, sat for a moment in the dark. Then he picked up the sealed letter, put it in his coat pocket, and went to bed for the first time in a week with something that felt, cautiously and incompletely, like peace. The letter reached Marshal Briggs on a Wednesday. By Friday evening, 2 of Briggs' deputies had quietly taken positions on the ridge above the South Road out of Harrow Flats, the same road the unmarked wagons had been using for months, and settled in to wait. Austin had to wait carefully. He knew from the pattern he had documented that a run was due within the next 48 hours. And he knew that Jeremy Rogers' men were creatures of habit the way all successful smugglers were, relying on the predictability of their routes, the same way legitimate merchants relied on the predictability of their supply chains. The ambush was not complicated. It did not need to be. 3 wagons, 6 outriders, 1 man riding ahead as a scout. Austin had written it all down from memory, every detail he had observed from doorways and stable shadows over the course of 2 weeks. And Briggs' men had used it to position themselves with the kind of precision that comes from good information delivered clearly. Austin was not there for the ambush. He had not wanted to be. His job was in town, and he had known from the moment he sealed the letter that the 2 things needed to happen simultaneously: the road and the office, the operation and the man behind it, or Patrick would hear the noise from the South Road and be gone before Austin reached the door. So while Briggs' deputies waited on the ridge in the cold dark with their rifles across their knees, Austin sat in the Silver Nail, nursing a glass of water and watching the clock above the bar and going over the sequence in his mind one more time. The statements were in his coat. The ledger was in his coat. The letter from Briggs confirming receipt and action was in his coat. Everything he needed was on his person, because he had learned from 12 years beside Patrick Walter that a good lawman never puts something important somewhere he can't reach it in under 3 seconds. At 10 minutes past 9 he stood up, buttoned his coat, settled his hat, and walked out into the night. The street was quiet. The sky was clear and enormous overhead, stars scattered wall to wall, the way they only got on cold, dry nights when the air had no moisture left in it to blur the light. Austin walked the length of the main street slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because he wanted to feel it. The boards under his boots, the cold air on his face, the specific weight of this particular night in this particular town that he had given 12 years of his life to. He had a feeling quiet and certain in the way that only true feelings are, that after tonight nothing in Harrow Flats was going to be exactly the same. Not for Patrick, not for the town, and not for him. The light was still burning in the sheriff's office when Austin pushed open the door. Patrick was at his desk, which did not surprise Austin. Patrick had always worked late, had always been the last light on the main street, and Austin had spent years taking quiet pride in that fact, reading it as evidence of dedication, of a man who took his responsibilities seriously enough to stay at them past the point of comfort. Now he read it differently. Now it looked like the behavior of a man who needed to keep watch. Couldn't afford to sleep too deeply or too long, because there were too many moving parts that required his attention, and too many things that could go wrong in the dark. Patrick looked up when Austin entered, and his expression did not change. He took in the coat, the set of Austin's shoulders, the fact that Austin had closed the door behind him and was not moving toward his own desk, and something behind his eyes made a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, like a man resettling his footing on uncertain ground. "Late night," Patrick said. "It is," Austin agreed. He crossed the room and stopped in front of the desk and reached into his coat and laid the documents down one by one. The 7 signed statements, the ledger with its columns of dates and amounts and names, the cross-referenced record of the smuggling routes, and finally, the letter from Marshal Briggs confirming that as of this evening his deputies were positioned on the South Road and the Roger operation was being interdicted in real time. Right now, while they stood here in this office, facing each other across 12 years and a desk full of evidence, Patrick looked at the documents without touching them. He looked at them for a long time, reading what he could from a distance, and Austin watched his face with the careful attention of a man who has spent his career learning to read what people don't say out loud. What he saw was not panic, it was not rage. It was something closer to exhaustion. The deep, bone-level exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down, even if putting it down means everything else falls too. Patrick's right hand moved. A slow, deliberate movement that Austin tracked without blinking, his own hand dropping to his side, and came to rest on the grip of his revolver. The room was absolutely silent. The clock on the wall marked 3 seconds. Then Patrick's hand lifted away from the gun, came up and over the desk, and set the revolver down on top of the documents with a sound that was somehow both very small and very final. He looked up at Austin. "How long have you known it was me?" he asked. His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "Since the fence line behind the church," Austin said. "The harvest dinner." Patrick nodded slowly. "And before that?" Austin looked at him. "I suspected from the morning Cutterdale shook your hand on the main street. I just didn't want to be right." Patrick nodded slowly as if that was the answer he had expected. He pushed back his chair and stood and held out his hands in front of him, not in surrender exactly, but in acknowledgement, in the manner of a man who understood that the accounting had come due and had decided at the last possible moment to meet it with whatever dignity he had left. Austin reached for the handcuffs on his belt. His hands were steady. Outside, somewhere down the South Road in the cold dark, Jeremy Rogers' operation was coming apart at the seams. Wagons stopped. Outriders disarmed. The architecture of months of careful criminal logistics collapsing under the weight of a deputy's documented observations and a marshal's well-placed men. But in the sheriff's office on the main street of Harrow Flats, the ending was quieter than that. It was just 2 men in a lamplit room, and the sound of a revolver set down on a desk, and handcuffs closing with a soft mechanical click that seemed to Austin in that moment like the loudest thing he had ever heard. He walked Patrick Walter out through the front door and onto the main street, one hand on his arm, and the town watched from its windows and its doorways in the way that towns watch things they have been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Silently, with their lights on and their curtains slightly parted, present but not ready to be seen being present. Nobody cheered. The stars were still hard and bright overhead. The cold air moved down the street in a long, slow current that smelled of wood smoke and winter coming, and Austin Williams walked the man who had made him down the main street of the town they had both served, and felt every single step. The trial of Patrick Walter lasted 4 days and drew people from 3 counties. They came on horseback and in wagons, some of them traveling through the night to get there, filling the boarding houses of Harrow Flats to capacity and spilling over into private homes, whose owners charged by the cot. They came because Patrick Walter had been a known man, known across the territory as a good sheriff, a steady hand, the kind of lawman other lawmen measured themselves against. And the spectacle of a good man's unmaking had a pull to it that people could not quite resist, no matter how much they told themselves they were coming for justice rather than the show. Austin sat through every day of it in the second row, not because he was required to, but because he felt he owed it to Patrick to be present, to not look away from what his testimony and his documents had set in motion. He sat straight and still and watched Patrick Walter answer questions in the flat, composed voice of a man who had decided before he ever walked into that courtroom that he was not going to perform remorse he didn't fully feel or dignity he hadn't earned. Patrick answered every question directly. He did not minimize, he did not deflect. He laid out his reasoning with the same calm clarity he had always brought to everything, and if the reasoning was rotten at its foundation, if the logic of a lawman deciding that the law was too slow and too weak to be worth following was exactly the kind of logic that made the law slower and weaker for everyone who came after, Patrick either didn't see it or had made his peace with not seeing it a long time ago. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. The verdict was what everyone in the room already knew it was going to be. When it was read, Patrick turned in his seat and found Austin in the second row and looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that Austin spent years afterward trying to name and never quite could. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't accusation. It was something quieter and more complicated than either. The look of a man acknowledging a debt, maybe. Or the look of a man recognizing too late and in the worst possible circumstances that the boy he had pulled out of an alley on a summer evening and given a badge and a purpose had turned out to be exactly what he had always said he was trying to make him. The bailiff touched Patrick's arm. Patrick turned away. Austin sat in the second row and looked at the empty chair where Patrick had been sitting and felt the grief move through him one final time. Not sharp, not sudden, slow and complete, like weather passing through a valley, leaving the air behind it clean and cold and changed. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after something large has passed through them. Jeremy Roger was not caught. His outriders had been taken on the South Road, but Roger himself had been nowhere near the operation that night, because men like Roger were never near their operations when the risk was high, which was how men like Roger stayed free for as long as they did. Austin filed a full report with the Territorial Marshal's office and added Roger's name to every wanted circular he could reach, and then he put it in the category of unfinished business that a lawman learns to carry without letting it bend him, because there was always unfinished business, and the alternative to carrying it was being crushed by it. Christine Tyler broke ground on the rebuilt store 6 weeks after the fire, on a cold, clear morning with frost still on the ground and her breath coming in small white clouds as she drove the first stake herself with a mallet she had borrowed from Hatch at the feed store. Austin watched from across the street, hat in his hands, and when she looked up and found him there, she held his gaze for a moment and nodded. A small, undemonstrative nod that said more than most speeches he had ever heard. He nodded back. The town had offered Austin the sheriff's position the week after Patrick's conviction. Formally and unanimously, the mayor and the council coming to the livery in a group and presenting it with the solemnity of people who understood they were asking something significant. Austin had thanked them and told them he needed a few days. He sat with it for 3 days and 2 sleepless nights, turning it over, examining it from every angle the way he examined evidence, looking for the place where it didn't hold, for the assumption dressed up as a fact, for the crack in the foundation that would widen under pressure. On the morning of the 4th day, he rode out to the county jail, where Patrick was being held, pending transfer to the territorial prison. He had not planned the visit, or maybe he had been planning it since the verdict and just hadn't admitted it to himself. The guard let him through without question. Professional courtesy, or maybe just the particular deference that people extend to a man who has recently done something difficult and visible. Patrick was in the third cell on the left, sitting on the edge of his cot with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, looking at the floor. He looked up when Austin stopped at the bars, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Patrick looked older than he had at the trial. Not broken. Patrick Walter was not a man who broke in any direction you could easily see, but settled. The way a building settles after the ground beneath it has shifted, and there is nothing left to do but find the new level and hold it. Didn't expect you, Patrick said. Didn't expect to come, Austin replied. He stood at the bars with his hat in his hands. They offered me the position, he said. Patrick nodded slowly, as if he had already known this, and had been waiting for Austin to arrive at the point. And you're not sure, Patrick said. It was not a question. Austin looked at him. I'm sure enough, he said. I just needed to look you in the eye one more time before I said yes. Patrick was quiet for a moment. He looked at Austin the way he had looked at him, across a broken bottle in a summer alley 34 years of combined experience ago. With the calm, deep-water steadiness that had always been his defining quality, that had made Austin trust him before he had any real reason to, that had ultimately made the betrayal so complete. You'll be a better sheriff than I was, Patrick said quietly. Not because you're smarter, not because you're harder, because you still believe it means something. He paused. Hold on to that. It goes faster than you think. Austin stood at the bars for another long moment. Then he nodded once. The same nod Patrick had given him in the alley all those years ago, when Austin had dropped the bottle and something had been decided between them that neither of them had words for. He put his hat on. I'll hold on to it, he said. He turned and walked back down the corridor toward the light. He did not look back, but he carried every word of it with him out into the morning, and all the way back to Harrow Flats, where he walked straight to the mayor's office and said yes. They gave him Patrick's badge, the same star Patrick had worn for more than 12 years, newly polished, every scratch buffed out as best they could manage. Austin held it in his palm for a long moment before he pinned it on, feeling the weight of it, which was both less and more than he had expected. He thought about what Patrick had told him on the morning he pinned on his first deputy's badge. 12 years ago now, in the young light of a spring morning, with the whole of Harrow Flats quiet and unhurried around them. The badge doesn't make you the law. You make the law. Don't ever forget which one of you is in charge. He had carried those words for 12 years like a second heartbeat. He carried them still. The difference was that now he understood them in a way he hadn't when they were first given to him. Understood that they were not just instruction but warning, that the man who had spoken them had ultimately failed to follow his own counsel, and that the weight of the badge was not just the weight of authority but the weight of the choice, made fresh every single day, to be worthy of it. He pinned it on, walked out into the morning. The street was waking up around him the way it always did, slowly, quietly, with the smell of wood smoke and bread, and the particular dry sweetness of the frontier earth that he had breathed every day of his life in this town, and never once taken for granted. Somewhere out beyond the edge of the county, Jeremy Roger was still riding. The law was still imperfect, still slow, still capable of being worn down by the wrong man in the wrong position over enough time. None of that had changed. But Austin Williams walked out into the main street of Harrow Flats on that cold, clear morning, with the star on his chest and the town coming awake around him, and understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has paid for his convictions and would pay for them again, that the law was worth the trouble, that it was worth the grief and the sleepless nights and the cost of doing right by people who had stopped expecting it, that it was worth everything it had taken from him. He took a breath of the cold morning air, and he went to work. And that is the tale of Austin Williams, a deputy who lost a mentor, kept his integrity, and rebuilt a town's faith in the badge one honest decision at a time. The Wild West was full of men like Patrick Walter, men who started right and drifted wrong, so slowly they never felt themselves go. But it was also full of men like Austin, men who chose, when the moment came, to be exactly what the badge asked them to be. That is what the sheriff's desk has always been about. Not the outlaws, not the gunfights, but the quiet, costly, necessary work of keeping a promise to the people who need you most. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Check out the channel for more lost tales from the frontier, because there are more stories where this one came from. Every town had a law. Every law had a story, and we are just getting started.